Thank you, Lars. I'd like to welcome aboard Dr. Judith Reisman, the author of Sexual Sabotage. In Sexual Sabotage, Dr. Judith Reisman, the prominent Kinsey whistleblower, returns to tell the story of how the K-bomb was launched from a Gothic limestone Indiana University building. Its time-released detonation set to silently emit erototoxic relativity into our atmosphere and unto the generations. Judith, thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me back, Chuck.
Judith, sometimes, usually and quite often in presidential campaigns, some interesting issues are inadvertently exposed in the course of questioning, particularly during debates. It can happen with either party. And in this time, we've had a very interesting glimpse into the workings of government in such a way that people can question the efficacy of those workings. And that was when Governor Perry of Texas, during one of the debates, was called upon his policy as governor of vaccinating young girls for the HPV virus and how that turned out to be very detrimental to their health. Can you give us some background on that, Judith?
Yeah, I'm glad to. I've been working in this whole area of the sexually transmitted disease vaccinations for our little kiddies for some years, ever since 1992, when Hep B was being mandated universally for newborn babies. Wee little hearts and no immune system even functioning. And I thought that's insane. So I followed that, of course, over the years and have written some stuff on that. And the Gardasil hit now recently is very important, and Michelle Bachmann, having mentioned that, really took a big hit from the mass media, which I consider ill-conceived in terms of the media critique, because the issue becomes what is wrong with our scientific, guardians, because certainly they should have been warning about this long ago. I know Science Magazine has talked about it to our inner sanctum people, those of us who are inside. But the public has not been warned about these massive vaccinations that are completely unjustified and counterintuitive and countervailing for our youngsters. It's bad news. It shouldn't be done, and there simply is not any justification for it out there.
Judith, I have a personal connection to this in that when my daughter was born prematurely, the hospital wanted to vaccinate her with 8 different vaccines, one of which was hepatitis B. And when I said that's not happening, there was the nastiest exchange between me and the hospital. They would basically ask me if I was a militia member. And it was the ugliest thing I've ever seen. I was going to expose it on the radio, and I was able to get her out of that hospital. And in time, my wife and I did vaccines when appropriate, and when she was a little older and a little more healthy, and it worked out fine. But it did seem rather bizarre to me that the state of Massachusetts had this policy of vaccinating infants with Hep B. I mean, that's a sexually transmitted disease that usually doesn't happen until, young women particularly are at least teenagers.
Well, I'll tell you,
by the fact that one of those vaccines,
I'll tell you the story about the Hep B that hit with my own family. When my little grandson was born, I told my son-in-law, I said, "Hey, you don't want this little baby vaccinated with Hep B." And he said, "Well, I don't know. We're trying to protect the child." And the nurse comes in. It's time for your vaccinations. Anyway, the doctor entered the room. He was an elderly doctor. And we're told that the medical doctors are not allowed to actually tell the patient not to have a vaccine or why not to have a vaccine. Anyway, so my son-in-law said to him, "Excuse me, doctor," he said, my mother-in-law here says that we should not vaccinate little Maxie with Hep B and for Hep B." And so the doctor looked at him and he said, "Well," he said, "no," he said, "if you expect him to be sexually active, then you should vaccinate him." So my son-in-law said, "What do you mean? He's just a newborn baby." So the doctor, of course, then looked at him and said, "Then why would you vaccinate him for a venereal disease?"
It obviously not only makes no sense, but I think the reason why Michelle Bachmann in this case was vilified and why the whole thing was covered up is because the big pharmaceutical companies and the government itself seems to want, there's a lot of money to be made here. It's a public policy matter that might have something more sinister involved that we can't even discuss here. I don't really know why, but it's very bizarre that that they're vaccinating infants at that age now as a matter of state policy. Let me welcome
aboard Dr. Patrick. It's an outrage. Yeah, I think it's an outrage. But hi, Patrick.
Hi, thank you, Chuck, and welcome back, Judith. It's been a while. We're always glad to have you and your cheerful demeanor and sometimes dismal news.
I know, isn't that awful? I know. Good gracious.
We need to get a couple of facts straight here. First of all, number one, the vaccination that was done in Texas under Governor Perry's was a vaccination against cervical cancer, and there not one single test. Not one single scientist, not one single experiment anywhere has ever turned up the side effect that Michelle Bachmann said that some unknown mother told her might have happened. So that's why she got vilified. She got vilified because she did not have a source. She came up with something that the entire scientific establishment, regardless of politics, was totally against, and was just absolutely, totally off the wall wrong. And also she got vilified because it's a long list of factual misstatements, all the way from Paul Revere ringing bells and shooting guns to this one. Secondly, a very good friend of mine actually got cervical cancer 4 years after she was married. It put her through a tremendous amount of agony. It means she's never going to have any children again. Fortunately, she did have one child, and she wished that she had been vaccinated against that. Thirdly, there was no cover-up here. This has been, if you can go, there are numerous websites by the CDC, by the drug companies involved that list all of the side effects of the vaccines, and the side effects do not include being made stupid or anything like that Michelle Bachmann came up with. It's a fairly routine kinds of things. Doctors know about it. I agree with Chuck, and also I think with you that parents should have the option of opting out of vaccinations, and they should be told in advance what any vaccinations are. And I'm not sure why infants need to be vaccinated either. But we just need to get the facts straight out here. The governor was trying to prevent cervical cancer. And cervical cancer, having had a friend who's
No, Patrick, with all due respect, there have been no long-term studies on Gardasil that would identify that Gardasil is legitimate to give to young children to prevent cervical cancer. First of all, we've got a long history, and let's not forget it, because we forget it at risk to all of us. We've got a long history of the medical profession going along with all sorts of things that were absolutely unconscionable. You can begin with Tuskegee. You're not going to end with Tuskegee, and that's the public health division of our society. Those were public doctors and so forth. We can talk about what was done to the Guatemalan women, giving them the STD vaccine kind of thing. We can talk about Willowbrook School, which is an outrage, and most people still don't know about that. The history of our own American doctors, and we haven't even gotten to Kinsey, by the way. I mean, we're talking about a scientific establishment that knows, that should know, and should be talking about the fact that children, infants as young as 2 months, were being used in scientific experiments for orgasm by Kinsey, who is now still in all of our laws in schools. So, how do we go now to Gardasil, where in 1992 they started with Hep B, and now they're hitting those little kiddies with HPV, and we're going into the classrooms, and we're not telling children to stay away from sexual activity the way I was brought up in terms of my school. And so now Big Pharma is making a fortune not only on Hep B and on Gardasil, which, by the way, has never been established as preventing cancer in any long-term study, all right? And if your friend wanted to get vaccinated, sure, let her do it when she's 20 years old, or and her body is mature. Let's not fool with that little brain that isn't even going to be functioning cognitively until it's roughly 21 years of age. This is massive experimentation, Pat. Absolutely unfair, unwarranted, and I couldn't care less about Perry or when and if he did whatever he did. I think it's critical that Michelle Bachmann raised it. I think that she was hit broadside, and I don't think that she was hit broadside for any reason except that our own scientific establishment should have been talking about this all over the place, and they have not been. Whew.
Why not?
Chuck, looks like it's time for a break.
First of all, Patrick, just as a little matter of correction, you're confusing your conservative women. It was Sarah Palin who talked about Paul Revere shooting guns.
You're right.
But that's okay. But getting back to the business, I mean, why aren't our governors, and Perry's not the only one. Here in Massachusetts, we had a policy in place by our governor, who was ever in office at the time my daughter was born. I think it might have even been Mitt Romney, unfortunately, that they were implementing these sorts of state policies across the board. I mean, is this some kind of a collusion between government and the drug companies? And obviously the drug companies are making a ton of money off of it.
You may be right in that.
Well, we know.
Coming up. We pick it up after the break.
Oh, okay.
Okay, we'll take a brief break. We'll be right back. Judith Reisman's our guest. Sexual Sabotage is the book, available in all major bookstores. We'll be right back. Okay, Dr. Judith Reisman's our guest. Sexual Sabotage. Patrick, why don't we go right to the emails?
Okay. Apparently people have been Googling like mad. This one is from Amy in Austin, and Amy says, your guest is incorrect when she says there have been no long-term studies of the HPV virus, the HPV cancer vaccination. See the British Journal of Cancer, estimating the long-term impact of a prophylactic human papillomavirus 1618 vaccine on the burden of cervical cancer in the UA, and then she gives a document number, but apparently it was published in 2006. I'm not going to read that. She also cut and pasted apparently the abstract. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the abstract says the model was calibrated with published data. The impact of the vaccination on cervical cancer and deaths, precancerous lesions, and screening outcomes were estimated for a vaccinated cohort of 12-year-old girls, among which it is estimated that there would be a reduction of 66% in the prevalence of high-grade precancerous lesions, 76% reduction in cervical cancer deaths. Estimates for various other measures of the population effects were also presented, and then it goes on with some very technical language. So apparently, we have one long-term study here. We've got two other emails.
No, we don't. No, we do not. No, we do not. Okay. That is not a long-term study. You're talking about a study that has to take at least over 20 years. I'd like to know what children are going to what parents are turning their children over to the medical profession for experiments on them with an STD vaccine. That's an estimate also we're hearing. No, there are no long-term studies. If somebody came to you and you had a newborn child and they said, hey, we've got this great new medication, this new pharmacy product, we'd like to try that out on little Sarah Jane and see if we can prevent cancer for her over the next 25 or 30 years. We don't have any information on what harms and what downside, whether it does contribute to autism, whether it will cause her to have a whole variety of other diseases, but we'd like to try that on little Janie. What are you going to say? No way, Jose. You bring your proven stuff to me later. No, there are no long-term studies. Long-term studies scientifically require minimum 20 years. And certainly when we're talking about giving it to young children, and Hep B, of course, that was right after birth. And then they stopped right after birth because of all the problems, and they brought it up to about 2 months, as if that made a difference. But Chuck asked, what was the connection? Well, we know that numbers of our big guys who are in government, who are working in the prevention area, that they move from government employment, and check that out on your Google, names and stuff, and they they're into working in high-placed positions in pharmaceutical companies. And then they move back again very often into government positions as well. No, big money greed always plays a role in our lives, unfortunately, whether we like that or not. And long-term studies require 20 years to 25 years to 30 years. There have been none. There isn't anything. And if there was, who in the blazes were they doing that to? What little children in Guatemala and Africa? Where are they going to get these little kiddies where mommy and daddy are going to turn them over to the pharmaceutical industry for experimentation?
Well, I haven't read the study. I only have and I'm not defending the drug companies. You're absolutely right. They own major pieces of the U.S. government and a whole lot of members of Congress. This was sent in by one of our listeners, and it says that there was a vaccinated cohort of 12-year-old British girls. You can read the study yourself. We have another one here from Manny342 Yahoo.com, who says that your guest is overlooking the Hep B problem. Hep B, it can be transmitted by a lot of things besides sex, and includes unsterile needles, cuts, infected women to newborn babies during the delivery process, and any kind of direct blood-to-blood contact, which can happen in automobile accidents and things of that nature. I'm not advocating for mandatory Hep B vaccination. We just want to make sure she gets her facts right.
No, her facts are very well known as far as that goes, and usually when I write about it, I do point out that if you have parents who are infected or in the medical profession and perhaps could have Hep B themselves, then there is some logic in saying to those parents, you know, when your baby is born, we'd like to make sure that you know that the baby could succumb to Hep B. That is, what percentage of the population apply to that? No, absolutely not. I'm very familiar with that research, and there is no justification for Hep B as a universal mandated vaccine for newborn babies whose brains have not even begun to develop. People out there, use your own noggins. If that brain is not going to develop cognitively, if it's in formation stage, much less the heart, the lungs, the rest of the body, look at that child. If that child is not developed in any way, shape, or form when they're born, and it requires that much time for that child to actually mature, why would you give the insult called? Why would you commit those insults on that baby's developing system when they're newborn or even when they're 12 years of age? Think about it. Use your own thought process.
I want to ask a slightly divergent question here. But before I do, I want to mention that Mitt Romney was not governor at the time my daughter was born. It was Paul Cellucci. But what do you think of this, just for the record, what do you think of this new flu vaccine? Is that something that young people should be having?
Oh, absolutely not. Look, you're talking to somebody here who would trust the pharmaceutical companies as far as, let's see, their bottom line of dollars, right? Look, Big Pharma has done some good things over time. There's no question. But anybody who relies on Big Pharma for massive injections, we know the problems we had, even with polio, for crying out loud. There were downsides, major downsides to that. But I won't go into the polio because there's some justification for that. But in terms of all of these other kinds of vaccines, the fortune is being made. We've got the vaccine producers are protected up the wazoo. We've got the government. We're paying for any lawsuits that hit. They've put caps on all kinds of lawsuits against neglectful use, neglectful information, and so on. No, Big Pharma is the biggest. Look, they're bigger than Steel ever was, or Big Tobacco, or any of those guys. So no, I would never trust them. No way.
I have to agree with you.
Right, and also they have been given immunity by Congress against lawsuits.
Yeah.
I think that speaks a lot. Yeah.
And you have to ask about why Congress would give immunity. I mean, who's getting paid here?
That's right.
What, does everybody out there live in Never Neverland with Cinderella? the idea that Willowbrook took place, injecting young children who were considered retarded with Hep B to test that on them. Tuskegee, did everybody forget that? Did everybody forget the LSD experiments on our soldiers? Has everybody forgotten all of these things that have gone on? The Guatemala thing that finally got exposed, the Kinsey research. People, we're living in a tough world, and unless the American public decides that they're going to demand that proof is given before they get exposed and they pay for all of this bizarre stuff so someone else can live in a big mansion, then we deserve what we get.
I have to agree with you about drug companies, and I would trust them, not even as far as their bottom lines, because I suspect that their bottom lines are pretty well skewed anyway in order to avoid taxes.
Yeah, well, I'll go with it.
So I have to agree with you there. There are facts on. I do, however, want to make sure that we are working on a factual basis here, and that when you look at the research that's been done, the ACR did a long-term study on cervical cancer vaccines, and they showed no long-term safety. I just want to make sure we're looking at the research properly. If I hadn't known somebody who had cervical cancer, I probably would totally agree with you, but after seeing what she went through, if there is a way to prevent it.
But she could do that later. She does not need to get that before she's sexually active.
I agree completely. I'm not arguing for that. Of course, you're about to run out of time.
I'm not talking.
You're right.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Judith, Sexual Sabotage, where's it available?
Oh, yes, WorldNet Daily or at your local bookstores. Get your local bookstores to stock it. But, WorldNetDaily.com. You can get it there. You can get it, that's where you can get it. And do read it and understand almost totally the information that comes out of the system.
I recommend it entirely. I recommend it heartily. It gives you a great insight into what we're up against. Judith Reisman, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Always happy to join you for cheerful topics.
Thank you, Judith, and I find myself mostly on the same side with you.
Thank you, Pat. It always delights me. Bye-bye.